Well, hey everyone, welcome back. In this session, I want to talk about what I believe is the center of youth ministry, and by that, I mean like where youth ministry is really going to happen, where life change is really going to happen, and my goal is to convince you that is going to happen primarily through small groups and one-on-one or one-on-two mentoring relationships. That is great as big events are, and as great as, or as impactful as messages are, that the heartbeat, the center of youth ministry is going to be in small groups and mentoring. Before we dive into that, though, just one little piece from the previous session that I meant to throw in and I forgot, but something that can just kind of be wrapped around all of this is to say that when you have stories of success, you know, in your church, especially as a result revolves around youth ministry, like when you see students doing what you really are wanting them to see done, or you see parents leading, or you see youth leaders mentoring, I would just really encourage you to share those stories of success, because that shows everyone else, like, okay, I can do this with God's help. I can do this. So, like, if share a story, you know, you can capture on video a mom and dad talking about mentoring, or father and son, or just some story that you could share. Maybe if you were a teacher, you could work into a message, but just somehow share that, because then people can go, okay, we can really do this. Because I think a lot of these concepts are so new to people that if they don't see how real normal people do them, it can be intimidating. But let's jump into talking about small groups and mentoring. Now, I want you to think about what was maybe the best small group experience you've ever had. Okay, so I'm going to assume that everyone's been in a small group of some kind at some point. You know, what's the best small group that you've been a part of? You know, what characterized that? What made it so good? My guess is that a lot of it had to do with the relationships. You know, I think about some of the best small groups I've ever been part of. I think of a group that we were in when we lived in Oregon, where we were just really close with everyone. Like, most of the people in our group were some of our closest friends. We saw a family, a couple, come to Christ through that group. They kind of got connected to our small group, and they weren't yet Christians, and both of them became Christians, and that brought a lot of excitement and a lot of joy to our group. You know, think about a small group that was really meaningful for you, or really impactful for you, and maybe consider why it was that way. So I think small groups are so impactful for us for a lot of different reasons. You know, a lot of churches, they've moved a lot of their ministry around small groups, and I think more and more youth groups are starting to move more of their ministry around small groups, and I think there's a lot of good reasons why. You know, small groups are really, they're really good for relationships. You know, they're intentional relationships. What makes the best small groups is it's not just about eating together, although that happens. It's not just about you know, small talk and coming over for big events and stuff, but it's about intentional relationships where you have a group of people that can really help you in your pursuit of God, and you can help them in their pursuit of God. And that's why I believe that small groups and mentoring relationships are the best way to accomplish youth ministry, because that's where real ministry really takes place. Now, to convince you why we should go in the small group direction, I want to talk about some problems with the typical way that a lot of churches tackle youth ministry, the problems with the youth service and what I'm calling the cool youth pastor. No offense to any cool youth pastors that may be watching this, but there's a few problems with this model, and here's what I mean. You know, a lot of youth groups have a youth service, and maybe that youth service is on like Sunday night, or maybe it's a midweek service. But a lot of youth groups have, really the heart of the youth ministry revolves around a service that involves great worship, lights, video, good teaching, dynamic teaching, and these services can be a lot of fun. In fact, you know, in our church's life with youth ministry, we certainly had a period where our youth ministry was mainly built around a youth service, a midweek youth service that was really big, featured music, and teaching, lights, all that kind of stuff. And there's a place, as we're going to see, there's a place for some of that stuff, but there's some problems with making the youth service the center of your ministry, this kind of big weekly event, sort of like a church service for teenagers. So here's a few of the reasons why. Problem number one is youth services are really hard to pull off. I don't know if you've ever tried to do that before, but it's really hard to pull off a youth service. This will dominate your youth ministry because you have to find a band, you have to get a band ready, pull a band together, you're getting a lot of volunteers together, a lot of resources to make that happen. You have to find people to run sound, you have to get slides ready, you have to find people to do the media, the announcements. And you know, for us, when we got away from this sort of model of youth ministry, we would pull like 200 students to a youth service. And so when you have a service of 200 students, it has to look pretty good. Like you can't. It has to look, you know, somewhat professional, somewhat I don't want to say slick, but it just has to have it has to match the size of the congregation. So it takes a lot of. It just takes a lot of work to pull off a big youth service. And again, what is the goal of youth ministry? Is it to pull off a big service? Well, no, obviously you know that. And then for many churches, they're not going to have the resources to pull off a big service. Like just the reality is a lot of churches and a lot of youth groups are just not the size where they're going to have the resources to come up with their own youth band that's, you know, that's really good from day one. They're not going to have the money, they're not going to have the personnel to pull off a youth service. And so that's why I think for a lot of churches, they should probably not depend on a youth service to kind of push and model their youth ministry after. The second problem that I see with youth services is the centerpiece of a youth ministry is that the youth service allows students to get lost in the crowd. And in fact, this was one of my biggest frustrations was when we had all of our youth meet together and it was just a big service. There's a lot of energy, which is great, and there is a lot of excitement. But here's what would happen is when I'd stand in the back, I'd watch the first 3 rows of the youth service, and the people in the first 3 rows, man, they were so into it. They had their hands raised, they had their eyes closed during the worship time. They were connected with God. It was great. But then as I looked back, like halfway through, you could see that people were less and less engaged, right? You could see that people were talking to their boyfriend or their girlfriend, or people were on their phones, or people were going back and forth to the lobby to do whatever it was they were doing. And you know, just like adults can hide in your church service, right? We're all aware of that. You know, adults will just kind of hide in the middle of a church service and not get connected to anyone. We had a lot of youth that were doing the same thing. They would come to the big event, but then they would get lost. They'd be disconnected from really anyone else, any leader, any other students. And so that's kind of a downside of a big service. You know, it's great to have lots of students, but how do you assess growth, right? If you just have an avenue where lots of people are coming, but that's all it is, just lots of people together, how do you assess their growth? How do you know that they're growing as disciples of Jesus? How do you know even what's going on in their lives, what's going on in their hearts? And so youth services make that really difficult. The third problem is, and really this might have been the most frustrating thing for me, is that youth leaders aren't empowered to lead in a youth service that features kind of just like a teacher. I mean, unless you're in the band or unless you do announcements or unless you're the teacher, youth leaders aren't empowered. You're not giving them anything to do. They're just there to make small talk with their students before and after the service. And what I noticed is we had a lot of youth leaders who really wanted to make a difference in the lives of students, but they weren't doing that because we didn't give them that opportunity. They just showed up to a service and we'd be like, hey, you need to take out the trash, you know, you need to like make sure that you know, the parking lot's safe and secure or whatever, but there wasn't like a lot of actual ministry to do. And that's because we weren't empowering them to lead. We weren't empowering our youth leaders. And you know, one of the things that I really believe strongly in is that as a pastor, your job is to equip Christians to do the work of the ministry. That's really what our role is as pastors. It's not to do the work of the ministry, but it's to equip people. And so to have all these volunteers that don't have a clear area to serve is a real problem for me, because our role is to equip them, not to do the ministry for God's people, but to empower them to do that, to equip them to do that. And when all of your ministry focuses around just a service, it makes that really hard. The fourth problem that I saw and see with the youth service is it has to do with the cool youth pastor. And by the cool youth pastor, what I just mean is a lot of youth ministries that are, well, you can grow a youth ministry to a pretty good size if you have a charismatic, and I don't mean like religiously charismatic, but just like a good on the stage youth pastor, right? Who is like engaging and funny and entertaining and can tell a good story. And that's what I call the cool youth pastor. So nothing against cool youth pastors. I appreciate them and their work of ministry. But the cool youth pastor has his limits. There is only so much that he can do. There's a certain amount of students that connect with any one leader. Right? So if your entire youth group is built on the personality of a pastor or the personality of a youth pastor, well, there's only so many students who can connect to that pastor, and then everybody else is just, you know, without connections. I've learned this. This was really demonstrated to me by Joey Bonif. Joey is a pastor in the Philippines. He's got a wonderful book called The Lego Principle. It's a great book on discipleship. It's not just for youth ministry, it's for all of discipleship. But one of the things that he says in The Lego Principle is he says that people are like, technically say people are like Lego, but that's hard for me. Sometimes say people are like Legos. But I know that that's technically, for any of you who want to correct me, I know that you're not supposed to add the S, but I'm just going to add it because it makes me feel awkward. People are like Legos. And what he means by that is, you know, if you have a Lego brick in hand, Lego brick only has connections, right? So if it's a 2x2, it's got the 4 bumps on the top. If it's a square, it can be connected to on the top and it can be connected to on the bottom. And he said that, you know, people are like Legos in that we only have so many spots for a connection. When it comes to discipleship, there's only so many people that we can be connected to. And so if you're telling your youth, like, well, hey, our youth ministry is built around our youth pastor, got to get connected, and if they're not connected to the youth pastor, then they're going to feel like they're not really being served in youth ministry. They're not really growing in youth ministry. They're not going to feel a part of it. And that's what's happened. I mean, that's even happened in our church in the past. We have a really dynamic youth leader. The problem is that the students are not connected to him, like they're on the outside of the ministry, and we see that repeated all over the place. I've helped churches before that have been in that situation where they have a really dynamic youth leader, but the kids who are really close to him are like, this is the greatest youth group in the history of humankind, and then the people who aren't close to the youth leader are like, you know, I don't feel connected here, and so that's why I would really encourage you to not come up with a youth model where all the emphasis is on the youth pastor. What you want your youth pastor to do is to do the same thing you'd want your pastor to do, which is to equip the saints for the work of the ministry, to lead the youth leaders so there's plenty of connection in church for everyone. You can have a youth group of 200 students where everyone's connected as long as there's not just 1 or 2 people for them to be connected to. But if there's dozens of leaders or a couple dozen leaders, then everyone can get connected. And then problem number 5, and this is the main problem, right? Services on their own don't help us accomplish the goal of youth ministry. I think that large gatherings of students have their place. They're not unimportant. It can be really important for Christian kids to get together in an environment with a lot of students, especially in areas where there's not a strong Christian presence. It can be really catalytic. A lot of students place to have a worship service or to have a game night. That stuff is fun. It's important. But you know, what is our goal? Our goal is to help students become disciples of Jesus who make disciples of Jesus. That's our focus. That's our heartbeat. That's what we want to see happen. And the big youth service doesn't pull that off. You know, large groups are great for celebration. They're great for being a catalyst. You know, one of the things that we do right now in our youth ministry is at several campuses, we do have a central meeting each week. The point of that meeting isn't to have just one great service that gives all that they need. The point of that service is to set up their small groups. So they come together, they have some worship time, they have some teaching time, but then they get into small groups, and that's really the heartbeat of everything they're doing. And so I think in a context like that, you know, if you have 3 or 4 small groups meeting on one night, or small groups meeting night, you can get everyone together and sing a little bit together and even have some common teaching. But real ministry, I think, is going to happen in the small group service, and or in the small group, not service, but the small group arena. And that's our next point, right? Real discipleship happens in small groups. This is one of my beliefs, is that real discipleship happens in small groups or mentoring relationships. Now, discipleship happens a lot of ways. Maybe this is slightly overstated. I mean, certainly people get discipled through messages and through sermons, and there are those certain moments in life where God teaches us something, whether we're serving in ministry or somebody just gives us some truth that we really needed to hear, that we didn't expect, and maybe those moments accelerate our discipleship process. But for most of us, I think real discipleship is best going to happen in a small group. And so by small groups, I've actually changed my thinking on this a little bit. I don't think I updated your notes. I think in your notes it says weekly small groups of between 5 and 15. You could cross that out if you want, because I would say it's more like 3 to 9. I'd say that's kind of more the ideal. I think for youth, I think for adults you can probably go a little bigger, but with the youth I feel like a little small. 3 could be, depending on the leader, 3 could be a little too small maybe, but I think much more than 9, it's really hard to get students to really share. But I think the goal for most of us would be to get our students in a small group context with an adult leader, 1 or 2 adult leaders, and then 3 to 9 students, where we can really talk about life and God and what we're learning and process that together. And there's a few reasons for this. There's a few reasons that I'm really excited about small groups. And the first is you can learn the needs of your students, right? That's one of the hardest things, even as we were just out of the last block there, the last session. In our discussions, one of the things we talked about is it's so hard to gauge if a student is on God with their life, because students, like most people, will tell you what you want to hear, right? That's the hard things. Someone commented, that's one of the hard things about being a pastor, is people will tell you what you want to hear. And students are going to tell you what you want to hear. And if students are just able to hide in a big group, then they're going to do that. And they're not going to want to tell you, like, well, I'm really struggling because my parents are getting a divorce, or I have this addiction in my life that no one knows about, or I'm really depressed because I just broke up with my boyfriend or girlfriend. Like, you can learn about the real needs of a student in a small group context, where you have rapport with them, where you build trust with them, where you really know them, you're there for them week in, week out, and you can really learn their needs. And you can minister to those needs, and you can even, you can look at a student after a while, like anyone you disciple or mentor, and you can say, like, okay, I can tell something's going on in your life. Do you want to tell me? Some of you are really discerning. Some of you have the gift of discernment, and you're really good at that. I do not have the gift of discernment, so I'm not really good at just looking at someone and telling when they're bothered. When they start crying, I'm like, oh, something must be going on in their life. But so I'm a little dull when it comes to discernment. But in a small group context, I have a better sense of trying to figure out what's going on in their hearts. The second benefit is that students can form meaningful relationships with other students. In a small group context, students can have real conversations about God with their peers, which is so important. Because even if you're a youth leader, even if you're a youth leader in your early 20s, pretty soon you forget what it was like to be a teenager, and you forget what some of these students are dealing with. And our culture changes rapidly all the time. And so our students with things like teachers who just dismiss faith in God as just kind of ridiculous, or they're dealing with issues of sexuality, gender issues. I mean, these gender issues were not an issue when I was in high school, really. I mean, it wasn't like an upfront issue for people. And so you have all these issues that students, they're trying to deal with, evolution, they're trying to process and deal with. And sometimes it's good for them to have an adult leader to talk to, but if they have another student, they can say, oh yeah, that this issue about evolution came up in my class. Here's how I thought about it, or here's how we dealt with it, or here's what it's like to be a Christian at my school, and this is how I feel isolated. When you put students in small group relations, they can form those bonds, and they can really start mentoring each other. Even we're going to talk a little bit more in just a little bit about how students can mentor each other, but this is sort of like informal mentoring of each other, when they can just talk about what they're going through and what they're processing in their schools. It's really powerful. And one of the ways too that you can break up cliques in a youth group is you can have some authority in how you put together groups, and you can make sure that small groups are a little more diverse, or just you can put different people in different groups in order to build new relationships and build new friendships, and maybe even kind of peel away some unhealthy relationships. And many of the guys that I'm mentoring right now who are young adults, they have some of their best friends from their youth small groups. The guys in their youth small groups are still their best friends, and they have a picture of how discipleship just brings us together closer to God, but also closer to each other. Okay, the third benefit, students can form meaningful relationships with mentors. So I like to think of the youth leader in a small group, the adult leader, the one or two adults. I like to think of them as mentors, because for some people, just the idea of discipleship, especially if you're a new Christian, you're not yet a Christian, discipleship is kind of a vague term to you. Mentors is a term that they can understand a little bit better. If I mentor someone, I'm training them, I'm building them up, I'm trying to teach them some truth, I'm trying to impart some knowledge to them. And so I like to think of these youth leaders as mentors. And what's great is in these small group relationships, they have adult leaders who serve as mentors and spiritual guides for their lives. If you remember, one of the best ways to keep a student in youth group and connected to church all throughout their teenage years, one of the best ways is to make sure that they have an adult who's not their parents who's pouring into their lives. Someone who they can go to, a subcontractor, right? That's the other term I like to use. They're a subcontractor. The contractor to go to and say, here's what's going on in my life. And when students have meaningful relationships with mentors, it can make a profound impact in their lives. I was just thinking of one of my friends, Jake, who is a mentor in a small group, and one of the guys in his small group was dating somebody who's not a Christian, and they were getting serious, and Jake knew this was a spiritual problem for this young man later on in life, and so Jake just lovingly confronted him and said, hey, is this really the kind of person dating, in the future? If you guys stayed together, where would this relationship go? You're a Christian, she's not. How are you gonna? How would you resolve that? And he was able to speak some pretty tough biblical truth into this young man's life, which, I'm sure his mom and dad probably tried, but he's a teenager, so that would well if they tried, or maybe they were afraid to. They didn't know how to do it, so they weren't able to do that. Or if I just came up as a pastor and said, "Hey, your parents told me you're doing this," that's not gonna end well. But if you have a relationship with someone, you can speak hard truth to them, right? Ephesians 4 talks about speaking the truth in love. Part of that means that you have to have relationships with people in order to speak hard truth into their lives, and that's especially true with youth, with students. They need to know that you're going to be authentic with them, that you care about them, that you're on their side, and so that's only demonstrated through time and through love, through the meaningful relationships that can be built in a small group setting. And really, those relationships, are not just built in the formal small group time of discussion. We encourage our leaders to get to know your students, to have fun together, to somehow have ongoing dialogue, because all of our mentors are adults, right? So they're busy. Either they're college students or they're adults with jobs. Some of them are families. Some of them are, parents with careers. And so there's a lot of ways for them to connect in the 21st century with Facebook and texting, all kinds of stuff. So there's a lot of ways to build meaningful relationships with students. It's not just in that time together in a small group setting. So that's benefit number 3. Benefit number 4 is your adult leaders are empowered to minister. As small group leaders, your adult leaders are going to do the real work of ministry, which is so exciting to me, because that's what the Bible says to do, to let God's people do the work of the ministry. And that's what you're empowering. In every ministry, as much as possible, I want to set up a context where the pastors can equip God's people to do the work of the ministry. And that's what happens, that small group leaders, they lead and they walk alongside their students. Really what happens is these leaders, they know their students better than the youth pastor does, a lot better than the youth pastor does. And they know their spiritual needs, they know how to pray for them, they know how to talk to their parents, they can sense issues that the youth pastor would never sense, because they're walking alongside the students. And the other thing that's just really cool is, your adult youth leaders can be training themselves to be future pastors, or to be future elders, future overseers in your church, because if you can, trust me, if you can lead a junior high small group, you probably can be a pastor one day. Like, it's, because Because there's nothing harder in ministry than to lead a junior high small group, or at least nothing much harder than that. And so if you can do that, there's a good chance that maybe one day you could be a pastor or certainly an elder at your church. And so you're just teaching people how to minister. A lot of youth leaders are younger adults, not all of them, and it shouldn't be all of them. I believe very strongly that you should have a good mix of youth leaders of ages. But a number of them are probably going to be young adults, college students just out of college age, and you can be training them to do real ministry with real people, your students. And they can learn how to make disciples, and that can prepare them for who knows what future ministry God's got planned for their life. So that's just a really exciting aspect of youth ministry. And then the other thing is, you're encouraging your youth leaders to do some difficult things in ministry, because ministry is hard. You have to have tough conversations, and sometimes it's a little easier to have a tough conversation with a student than it is with an adult. And so that's another feature of having your adult leaders do real work of ministry, right? We said that in a more passive youth ministry where it's all about, a youth service. And when I say youth service, you don't need to think of this like in terms of just a bigger youth group with a couple hundred students. Even in a youth group with like 30 students, if they have a youth pastor, sometimes that youth pastor can just sort of suck up all the work of the ministry. And so there's youth leaders, but they just go and they just watch the youth leader teach, watch the youth pastor teach, watch the youth pastor lead worship, watch the youth pastor sort of do all that stuff with the kids, even in a smaller youth group setting. And so really encourage your youth pastor, or if you're thinking about setting up your youth ministry, how can you set it up to where all the adult leaders are empowered to minister? Where the youth pastor views himself as a leader of leaders and not just the one who's going to do all the work of the ministry. And then the fifth benefit is that student leaders can begin to lead their peers. That's what we see going on in small groups. You see it informally sometimes. Informally in terms of, like I said, kids just sharing about their lives with each other, just talking about what's going on. And that way they're ministering to one another. They're beginning to mentor one another. They're beginning to, as iron sharpens iron, they're beginning to sort of work on each other and in their own lives. But then also you can have student leaders just lead parts of small groups. We have pretty structured small groups, meaning like a time for going over the lesson, summarizing the lesson, if it's like based on a youth lesson that they heard somewhere else, or if it's a sermon-based lesson or something like that. Then we have a time of questions the questions are already created beforehand by a team, although small group leaders are allowed to adapt those as needed. And then there's a time of structured prayer, praying. And so one of the things that we encourage our leaders to do is to share some of those responsibilities. As students begin to show some maturity and some responsibility, we say, well, how about you lead, this part? How about you summarize the lesson for us? Or how about you pray for the group, or lead them in prayer, or sometimes even you lead the questions. If an adult leader is going to be gone, we've appointed students before to lead the group, and sometimes that means the small group lasted for about 3 minutes that night, and that's happened before. I'll just be honest with you, it doesn't always go perfectly. Sometimes the students does anyone have anything to share? No one does. Like, all right, well, let's pray. So you also need good training. You need better training for that kind of a situation. But that's okay. Let's fail sometimes. And I always tell our leaders, I am okay with failure, because failure means you're trying new things. You're giving opportunities for the Holy Spirit to come through. You're not just okay with the status quo. So, give opportunities for your student leaders to lead their peers. And sometimes we'll talk more about this in the next section too, but we'll have older high schoolers lead junior hires and stuff like that, so that they can have real tangible experiences in leading. There's one more benefit that I thought of that I didn't put on your notes, just kind of hit me today, basically, and that's that a small group can meet anytime and anywhere. That's one of the beauties of a small group. If you say our youth ministry is Wednesday night at 7 p.m., and if you want to be connected youth person at our church, then you better be at our church Wednesday at 7 p.m. Well, guess what happens? What if What if someone's got soccer Wednesday at 7 p.m.? Or what if someone's got a basketball game? Or what if someone's got band practice? Or what if someone is working and their Starbucks shift is Wednesday at 7 p.m., right? There's a whole host of reasons. Or maybe they don't have a ride and you can't give them a ride or whatever. If you only have one youth ministry option, then you're going to limit the pool of students who can be part of your ministry. But in a small group system, here's what you can do. You can have small groups every night of the week if you want. You can have small groups that meet at your church. You can have small groups that meet in homes. You can have small groups that meet at coffee shops. I mean, it's really unlimited potential, right? Unlimited potential for what we can do. And most of our small groups at a campus, because we're a multi-site church, so we have multiple campuses, most of our small groups do meet at a certain night at a campus. So, like I said, if it's Wednesday night, if you come to a campus on Wednesday night, or the campus I'm currently at, they were on Sunday nights. So if you come here on a Sunday night, there will be worship, and there will be, a little, like a 5-minute teaching from the stage. But then, pretty quickly, you'll break up into small groups. But those aren't the only small groups that happen related to the campus. There's small groups that happen other nights of the week. They're going through the exact same curriculum. That's why we publish our curriculum on our website and just put it out there, so it's easy for leaders to find and for parents to find. And just think about, like, okay, how maybe you want to open up your church if you have a church building. Maybe you want to open it up 3 nights a week for small groups, and maybe adult and or youth small groups. Just say, here's the rooms we have available. Your small group can use our facility. Here it is. Or maybe you've got some money in the budget, and you say, let's just start a small group at McDonald's at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday night, and let's just see what happens. We're gonna give that leader some money, and we're just gonna test it for a few months and see what happens. I mean, who knows? There's all kinds of ways that this happens, and I've noticed. I mean, this is just sort of an aside, but I've traveled a lot across the world, working with churches in different countries and stuff, and it's interesting how a lot of youth ministry in a lot of other countries happens at places like the mall, or just kind of happens in more, well, we would say more informal settings. I've been in small groups in malls in Asia, where like youth ministries have tons of small groups, and they all meet at the mall. So there's just a lot of ways to do ministry. I think sometimes we just limit ourselves, and through our lens of, well, this is what I did when I was a kid, or this is what the church down the street does, so we should do the same thing. Well, there's a lot of ways to do ministry. I'm hesitant to think, I don't know what the digital world as that develops, what that's going to bring. I'm a little hesitant to think like small group over the internet's the best way to do small group. But we're doing ministry training over the internet, so who knows? There's just a lot of options out there, and so let's just stay open to figuring out how we can use technology to help people pursue God and to further the name of Christ. Now, there are a few cons of small group ministry. There are a few drawbacks. I'm giving you all the upside. I'm giving you all the pluses. I want you to be like, wow, small group ministry is so great. There's never going to be one setback. And then you email me 6 months from now and be like, Scott, you never told us. You never told us about all the hard stuff. We'll tell you about some of the hard stuff. I'd say the biggest hard thing is if your groups are bad, if your small groups are bad, your youth group suffers. So and here's what I mean. If students show up to small group and the leader's not there, that's a problem, right? If the leader doesn't show up, that's a problem. And that's happened before at our church. If you sit in on the small group and you can tell that the leader has not looked at his or her notes until 5 seconds before the group started, that's a problem, and it's not gonna lead to a good discussion. It's not gonna lead to a fruitful time. If your group leaders aren't trained enough, and so they and I've seen this happen before, where they throw out one question and nobody answers. And they're like, okay, next question, and nobody answers, and they do the third question, the other adult answers, and that's it. And, that's a pretty awkward small group, and so you need to train your leaders on how can we overcome that, how can we be beyond that, because there's a lot of ways to do that. And if you've done any small group training with adults, it's pretty similar. You just calibrate it a little bit to students, but understand that if you have poor small groups, then you're going to have a poor youth group. So that means you have to invest in training your youth leaders. and you have to make that a real priority. To the point where I would say don't let people be small group leaders. Don't let people be mentors until they've been mentored, right? Don't let someone be a small group leader. If someone's never been in a small group before, if they've never been in a healthy, disciple-making small group, they're probably not ready to lead a youth small group. And so even if you got to slow your ministry down for a season, and we've done that, we've slowed our ministry down as we've moved to a more discipleship-oriented ministry. We lost about 30% of our youth group. I'll just be honest with you, we lost that, and that wasn't purposeful, but I knew that would probably happen, just because there were a lot of students that were there for various reasons, and we knew that changing to a discipleship culture was going to cost us in terms of numbers for a while, but the end product was going to be so much better that we were totally willing to suffer through that. And so maybe even with your leaders, you need to say, like, man, I'm so glad you're happy. I'm so happy and glad that you want to be a leader, but here's the process. This isn't going to just happen overnight. We need to make sure you're plugged into a small group. We need to make sure you're being mentored and you're really ready to mentor other people. We need to observe you doing it. We need to watch you ask questions, because if the small group's not strong, it's just going to hurt your small group. And that's why it also is good to have a central gathering time. So I started this whole thing off by saying, don't have a youth service, and I still mean that. I don't think the best youth ministry is a youth service that's almost the exact same as like the Sunday morning adult service. But I think if you have a central time with some common worship and announcements and just like a catalytic environment, then I think that makes small groups better. Because the reality is that some of your small group leaders are going to be super extroverted, and they're going to be super loving people, and they're going to be funny and hilarious, and they can get kids talking real easily. And then some of your small group leaders, they're going to be more introverted, and they're going to be more thoughtful, and they're going to be more sensing, and you need to be able to set those groups up for failure too, because those leaders are just as important and they're just as valuable as your extroverted leaders. And so you need to think about how can we set up our small groups for success. So con number one, if your groups are bad, then your youth group suffers. The other big con that we experience is that small groups are intimidating for visitors. And this is a reality. You know, we said, remember, discipleship, the beginnings of discipleship is evangelism. And you want to bring someone to the point where they put their faith in Jesus, where they get baptized as a response to that they've accepted Jesus as their Savior, right? And so evangelism is key to a healthy ministry, a healthy youth group ministry. But small groups can be really awkward for visitors, because probably my guess is that the average 16-year-old in your community doesn't like go to a random person's house and sit around with a bunch of 14 to 17-year-olds talking about their feelings in God. That probably is not the typical experience in your community. So how do you get a new person? How do you get a new person to enter into a small group? I think one of the ways is if you have great small groups. You know, if you have great small groups where your students are like, I just love our leaders, I just love the discussions we have, I love the other students in here, then they can go to their friends and say, hey, come to our youth group. And they can sell their small group to their friends, and you don't have to do it, because they'll do it. If they really feel like their small group is meaningful and impactful and is a connecting place, then they will become evangelists for your small group. But also, you need to help leaders be trained to expect new people and accept new people. So that means, like, if I'm a new person, if I'm a guest at your small group, like, don't ask me to pray. That would be one thing. I'm a Christian, so please don't ask me to pray. You know, don't ask me to share too much, but just, you know, let all those things about how to make guests feel welcome. You need to train your youth leaders to do that very same thing with new youth that come, because it's going to be really awkward for them, and it's okay to acknowledge that awkwardness, and let's just work through it. And you need to think of the whole spectrum of discipleship in your youth group. You know, another criticism I guess I have, though I mean that sounds like a negative word, but it doesn't need to be negative. But you know, some youth groups, they're pretty inward focused, and so they talk about evangelism, but practically they don't really do evangelism. And if like you have a youth group where everyone in this youth group has been together since 3rd grade, they're just not going to be very outward focused. And if you look at your curriculum, it's probably not real inclusive of people who might be new to the faith or are not yet Christians. And so I think it's good to look at what your youth are studying and say, is there stuff here that is good for people who aren't yet Christians? people who are young Christians. I mean, I guess they're all young Christians, but I mean like immature Christians. And what we've noticed is there's certain seasons of ministry in youth group, and there's times when we expect a lot of visitors. There's times where we know that there's probably not a lot of visitors coming, so we can tackle some issues that are a little deeper. And we just kind of want to be aware of that. We don't want to get stuck in just one type of ministry. We want to disciple a person through a whole life of discipleship, but we don't want to lose sight of evangelism even in our small groups. And then the other thing is, if you have a strong small group and mentoring culture in your youth group, you also need to have good entrance paths for new people, good gateways for new people. Because again, and I just feel like I have to say this over and over again, because I don't want to lose sight of that. Because sometimes when you stress discipleship, people forget about evangelism, but they really just go together. But so you need to create pathways for people to come into your youth group and get connected to small groups. And see, that's why when I was saying that I'm not against fun activities and overnighters and stuff, I'm really not. Let's just use those as avenues to get students plugged into real discipleship relationships, right? So how can we get, 100 students to a church activity to play video games one night? That's great. And like 50 of them are not going to be from our church. So we're going to get 50 new students who we know nothing about their spiritual life. We're going to get them to our church to play video games, or if you're anti-video game, whatever you're not anti, whatever would be okay. Get them to your church to go and do that, whatever it is. Okay, so we got 50 new students. How do we take them into this welcoming event, and how do we start to connect them to our small group ministry? How do we make that look inviting? How do we kind of set that up to be something meaningful? Remember what students also said. It said that students will stick it out with your church if they feel that the church will help them make real decisions about everyday life, and that the messages are attached to everyday life. So how do you tell these new students, hey, we're a church, and you might think churches are out of touch, but we're really actually in touch with your life and what you're struggling with, and we want to help you. Think about how to do that. How do you make good entrance paths for new people? So there's some cons. There's a lot of pros for small groups, and for even breaking small groups down further into one-on-one, one-on-two, one-on-three mentoring relationships. But there's also some difficulties too that you just have to navigate, and with a lot of prayer and with a lot of dialogue. Let's end this session though by talking about how small groups enable generations of disciple making, because that's what really excites me. I'm a big thinker. I like to think about like big vision-y kinds of things, and that's why one of my favorite Bible verses is 2 Timothy 2:2. 2 Timothy, of course, is written by the Apostle Paul, and he's writing it to his spiritual son Timothy, and he says to Timothy, and this is one of Paul's, this is probably Paul's last book. This is at the end of his life, shortly before his martyrdom, and what does he say to Timothy? He says, "And what you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also." So what Paul is saying here is, he's like, Timothy, now look, you've heard me teach the truth, right? Over and over again, year after year, you've heard me teach the truth, and you've seen me do that in churches and on missionary trips together. You've heard me teach you've heard me teach the truth, which is the gospel, the deposit of the faith that was passed down from the apostles. You've heard this, and what I have entrusted to you, because Paul's like, I've poured into your life, Timothy. I've taught you the truth about who Jesus is and the gospel and all the implications for your life, and the word that we would use like justification and sanctification and all these things. Paul's like, I've taught that to you, Timothy, and now I want you to entrust this to other people, faithful men, or I don't think it's talking exclusively about men here, but faithful men and women. So Timothy, I want you to make disciples. Paul made Timothy into a disciple, and now Timothy is going to make disciples. But that's not the end of this verse, is it? But that's a lot of times how we think about discipleship, right? When I was discipled throughout most of my life, I had a guy who discipled me. Some guy, either I asked him to disciple me, or most of the time I asked them to disciple me, as I think about it right now. One time someone was more proactive and said, I'm going to disciple you. And so somebody discipled me, and that meant that they made sure I was trusting in Jesus and made sure that I was honoring God with my life. But then it kind of stopped. They never really said, like, now go and do this with someone else. They just kind of discipled me for a while, and then they were done. And that's how a lot of discipleship works, right? You meet with someone, maybe you meet with them at Denny's or at Starbucks or whatever, and you meet for a few years, a couple of years, and then you're kind of done. and you choose someone else to disciple. Well, that's not really what Paul has in mind for Timothy. He's like, Timothy, I discipled you. Now you go disciple other people, but you're not done until those people disciple even other people. See, that's the disciple-making generations at work. Paul's like, Timothy, you need to disciple people in such a way that they'll be ready to disciple others. In other words, what we're making is we're making disciple makers. We're not just making disciples, we're making people who make disciples. And so my responsibility, when I think about making disciples of students, I'm not done until I have discipled them, I've mentored them, but I'm not done until they are mentoring other people. At that point, now I'm okay. I think this is now we're starting the cycle. Because just think about that. If I could, if I had like a whiteboard, I could draw this out with you. But it takes some time to draw out what's going on in this verse. You have Paul. Paul disciples Timothy and Titus and other people, right? And then you just follow Titus's tree. And Titus disciples faithful men. Let's say he disciples 5 other guys. And then those 5 faithful men, according to 2:2, they disciple others who are able to teach. So those 5 disciple another 5. You can see that tree, right? That's like an Amway period, right? Amway pyramid that's building there. I only say that because people have said, "Is this Amway?" And it's like, no, it's not Amway. This is God's view of discipleship, right? It's this awesome. It's this thing. It starts with Paul, and he passes on to Timothy and others, and Timothy, he transfers it to 5 guys. I mean, who knows how many, but we'll just say 5. And they'll pass on to another 5. And those of you who know math real well, you can do the math. This thing explodes. And this is what I think small groups really enable us to do this. Small groups enable me to take 5 guys and say, all right, guys, I'm going to disciple you. And I'm going to disciple you. And I'm not done until you're discipling other students, until you're discipling other people. And then I'm like, okay, I've done my work with you, and now I'm ready to go find other people who need to be discipled. And imagine what would happen if we do that, where we just raise up this generation of students in all of our churches, no matter what the size of our church is. We're just going to raise up, if you're a church plant or if you're going to plant a church, you're going to start this from day one, that all of our adults, all of our students, even our kids are going to have this vision of discipleship. And I think about how this would transform our churches and our communities, in your state, in our country. I mean, when you start to map out the numbers, you see how God's plan for discipleship, it just changes the world. And that's what happened, right? Isn't that what happened? It started in the book of Acts, that you have a small group of people, a small group of disciples, a small group of men and women who are filled with the Holy Spirit, and then they just start telling others about Jesus, and it just grows. And it takes over it goes all throughout the Roman Empire and then beyond. And that's what happen when you unleash discipleship God's way. And I really believe that the best place to do that for us is in a small group setting where you can empower, as we talk about 2 Timothy 2:2, you might be like, oh yeah, that's Paul and Timothy. Like, of course they're going to be really successful. But this is a pattern, I think, for every Christian to say, okay, who are the faithful people that I'm going to pour into? And who are they going to pour into? And I'm going to be, who am I going to be a spiritual grandfather for and a spiritual great-grandfather for? And you have this responsibility to coach and lead through this process. I mean, it's so exciting. And really, for me, one of the most meaningful moments in ministry for me for a long time were when I would be part of leading someone to faith, and I'd get to baptize them and see them grow in the faith. To me, that was the most exciting thing to say, like, man, remember when you were a pagan? I never said that to him, but I was, remember when you were lost in your sins? No, but just to see them, to remember what they were like before Christ, and to be part of that, God gets the credit, but to be part of that whole process. Now what's even more exciting is when I'm part of discipling someone, whether that means I help lead them to faith or not, but when I'm part of discipling someone to the point where I help them start to disciple someone else, and then they lead someone else to Christ. When I see someone I've discipled lead someone else to Christ and baptize them and teach, and now they're teaching someone else to obey all that Jesus commanded, to me that is the most exciting thing that I get to do in ministry. And I'm so thankful for each and every opportunity that I have. My hope is that our youth ministry would just be places where that happens over and over and over again. So I think we're done with this session, and I want to just go ahead and encourage you to just leave with that thought. I'd encourage you to spend some time at some point in the next couple days praying and just meditating on 2 Timothy 2:2 and what that means for your youth ministry and your own personal ministry. But now we're going to go ahead and stop here, and I'll turn you over to your discussion questions.